They tried to bring him down, with coups, with accusations, with pressure from powerful generals like General Langley. But instead of falling, President Ibrahim Traoré rose even higher. What was meant to isolate him only amplified his voice on the world stage. And now, support for him is coming from unexpected places, not just from the streets of Africa, but from surprising allies across the globe. So, what exactly is happening in Burkina Faso? And why is the world paying attention? Whole countries have stepped forward in the wake of the failed coup, reaffirming their allegiance to President Traoré and Burkina Faso. These include Cuba, a long-standing ally whose ties to Burkina Faso are based on revolutionary solidarity and common struggles. Denmark's reaction is surprising, but Cuba's support is not. Denmark closed its embassy in Ouagadougou just a year ago. That same country is now reopening the door, indicating a change in policy and attitude. The world is paying attention, and the message is obvious. There are significant questions raised by this renewed foreign participation. Why are countries who previously distanced themselves coming back to the table? What does this indicate about Burkina Faso's new position in the world order and Traoré's increasing influence? Today's story looks at the changing diplomatic environment and how the failed coup might have changed Burkina Faso's foreign policy more than any meeting or speech ever could. One thing is clear: Burkina Faso is no longer marginalized, whether in Havana or Copenhagen. We're entering the past. Denmark took a small but important step in August 2024. It declared that its embassies in Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso will be closing. At first glance, the explanation appeared tactful and standard. In a well-crafted statement, Denmark's foreign ministry said that, as part of a new Africa policy, it will close its embassies in Burkina Faso and Mali and establish new missions in Senegal, Tunisia, and Rwanda. The embassies in Burkina Faso and Mali will close due to military coups that have drastically reduced the area of action in the Sahel. Although it seemed methodical, realistic, and reasonable, the truth is always more nuanced. The majority believe that the closures were a direct reaction to the military takeovers that rocked these countries, Mali in 2020 and Burkina Faso in 2022. But this was not the true reason for Denmark's departure. Between Denmark and Burkina Faso, there was no open confrontation, no diplomatic breakdown, and no animosity. The geopolitical arrangement was altered. Mali and Burkina Faso had changed their allegiances, eschewing their previous allegiance to the West in favor of new alliances with China, Russia, and other Eastern nations. Western capitals saw this as betrayal and a defiant rejection of Western influence, not just a shift in policy. Like many of its partners, Denmark also had to make a decision. Signaling allegiance to the Western Bloc was more important than logistics or embassies. The embassy's closure turned into a silent protest and a symbolic show of disapproval, not directed against the Burkina Faso people, but rather at the country's leaders' right to make their own decisions. Therefore, the reality was much more political, even though the official position emphasized limited operational scope. Countries like Denmark were shifting their positions in response to the West's waning influence in the Sahel. This was pressure disguised as procedure, not diplomacy. Denmark may have believed that by closing its embassy in Burkina Faso, it could exert a slight amount of pressure. Maybe Copenhagen thought that President Traoré would change his mind about siding with Russia and the East and return to the West after facing diplomatic isolation. However, none of that took place. Neither President Traoré nor the military chiefs of Niger or Mali blinked. Rather, they remained committed to their goal of escaping decades of Western influence. The West failed to shake them after playing its card. The tale takes a turn at this point. Denmark never did. No significant action has been done to close the Danish embassy in Ouagadougou since the announcement in August 2024. It remains present, functional, and involved. Then why the bluff? Because it is unpleasant to face the reality. Africa is significantly more important to Europe than it is ready to acknowledge. Politicians in the West have long portrayed Africa as a burden, a continent that is reliant on handouts and incapable of supporting itself. But why the fear of China's and Russia's increasing might if that were really the case? Why is re-establishing diplomatic footprints so urgently necessary after they have been cut? Western countries wouldn't give a damn who filled Africa if it were just a recipient, an empty vessel waiting to be filled. However, they are concerned because there is a truth hidden beneath the story that they choose not to discuss aloud. Africa has the markets, the resources, and the future population. Europe is aware of this. There is no diplomatic reason for Denmark's reluctance to depart. Dependency is the issue. One thing is evident despite the formal rhetoric and behind-the-scenes conversations. Africa is no longer in need of help. Furthermore, the West has lost some of its confidence. Sometimes the truth comes out via policy rather than protest. Denmark's foreign minister made a startling admission that many Westerners are reluctant to make aloud. Africa has never had more geopolitical significance or impact in world affairs. Africa will be home to 1 in 4 people worldwide by 2050. He wasn't merely stating the truth. He was indicating a change in authority, in the populace, in the possibilities. He recognized the silent fear of the West, that Europe can no longer afford to treat Africa as a subordinate continent as it rises. The closing of the embassies in Mali and Burkina Faso. They were never about logistics or safety. They were a political reaction to the eastward shift of the continent, to Russia, to China, to sovereignty. However, Denmark hasn't closed an embassy since that declaration. Why? Because the West is frantically trying to maintain its hold behind the scenes. The urgency is also increasing. The minister went on to say that whether Africa will lean more toward the East or the West is one of the most significant foreign policy issues of this century. Europe now seeks to demonstrate that it can provide something superior in this geopolitical tug-of-war. More money, more trading, more grants. African countries, however, are no longer awaiting Western endorsement. They are selecting their supporters. Their futures are being defined. It is evident from leaders such as President Ibrahim Traoré. Africa will no longer play a supporting role in another person's scheme. The continent is not pleading for collaboration, it's asking for deference. And whether Europe can retake Africa is not the topic at hand. Whether Africa still desires what Europe has to offer is the question. Now everything starts to make sense. Denmark had no real intention of cutting its connections with Burkina Faso. Furthermore, its actions today are more powerful than its previous declaration. Denmark has completely reversed its 2024 announcement that it will close its embassy in Ouagadougou. In addition to keeping the embassy open, Denmark has taken prompt action to reaffirm its commitment to the Burkina Faso people following the unsuccessful coup. Jean-Emmanuel Ouedraogo, the Prime Minister of Burkina Faso, greeted Nigel Marcusson, Denmark's special representative for the Great Lakes and the Sahel, just 1 week after President Traoré was overthrown. They met with Denmark's current ambassador, Christian Kierkegaard Eidinger, to discuss what can only be called a diplomatic reset that is discreet and affirms Denmark's commitment to remain in the Sahel. Marcusson was clear about Denmark's stance after the meeting. Denmark recognizes each nation's right to make its own decisions. We are a small nation with independent decision-making. In stark contrast to the typical approach Western countries take with African leadership, it was a unique instance of diplomatic humility. She commended the two nations' nearly 40-year-old partnership, which is based on cooperation on matters like access to clean water and agriculture. However, there is a deeper truth hidden beneath the politeness. Much of Europe, including Denmark, is readjusting. In a continent that is no longer passive, the West is aware that it cannot afford to lose influence. The world is starting to adapt as Burkina Faso, under Traoré, asserts its autonomy. Silently, with caution, but clearly. Isn't Denmark's change in position noteworthy? How did Burkina Faso come to be recognized as an equal sovereign state rather than as a project? Western countries have traditionally considered African governments to be weak, unreliable, or in need of oversight. However, President Ibrahim Traoré has vehemently disputed that account. Denmark has discovered what others are only now starting to realize. It's not a puppet, Traoré. His government has stated as much. The sovereignty of Burkina Faso cannot be compromised. Denmark isn't just giving up now either. It's a sign of respect. Diplomacy isn't the only factor here. It has to do with power relations. Traoré did not plead for dignity. He gave the order, and the rest of Africa needs to learn that lesson. African leaders have only ever been viewed by the West as assistance beneficiaries, nominal partners, and occasionally as pawns in international power struggles rather than as true equals. But the main reason that inequality has persisted is that far too many African leaders have come to terms with it. Due to frailty, due of greed. Take a look at Kenyan President William Ruto, who is eager to offer troops to support American interests in Haiti, reacting like a child seeking approval from a parent who lives far away. It's more than just embarrassing, it's risky. Because having the guts to refuse is the first step toward actual autonomy. No, Traoré answered. Even Denmark is listening now. However, President Ibrahim Traoré stands out from the rest. He has been very clear about one thing. Only equality will be accorded to him. And who doesn't want to? They'll be disregarded. This is what effective leadership is all about. Remaining true to principles rather than seeking approval from world powers. Traoré has demonstrated to the world that one does not have to beg for sovereignty. Enforcing is necessary. Furthermore, Burkina Faso's relationship with Denmark has changed as a result of this tough position. Other Western powers have been compelled to reconsider their strategy. Germany was one of them. Germany was one of the first countries to denounce Traoré when he came to office. Following France's example, it halted diplomatic contacts and stated that they would only be restored if Traoré shifted to civilian governance. However, the West made a mistake once more. Their pressure effort was unsuccessful. Burkina Faso refused to budge. Svenja Schulz, Germany's Minister of Economic Cooperation and Development, landed in Ouagadougou to make amends, not to lecture. She declared that Germany was prepared to re-establish diplomatic relations. Indeed, she reiterated Germany's inclination towards democratic institutions. However, she revealed something uncommon in a moment of startling candor. The majority of people on the planet reside under non-democratic regimes. And that is the fact that Germany must face. That is to say, Traoré remained the same. Germany did. There is no longer a black and white approach to diplomacy, the German minister said. Just hints of strategic necessity. She freely acknowledged that other countries would take Germany's place in the Sahel if it left. And others obviously meant Russia in this instance. She didn't hold back. Germany could not afford to leave the area to Russian influence and leave it alone. Diplomacy encased her message. The subtext, however, was obvious. Berlin is concerned. What used to seem like moral superiority now sounds desperate. Because this is the reality. Europe is not necessary for Africa. Europe, however, is in dire need of Africa. The markets, the resources, and the geostrategic location. The cards are now in Africa. Traoré is also playing his hand fearlessly. Cuba, however, remains steadfast, unflinching and unaffected as the West frantically tries to reorient. Cuba never abandoned Burkina Faso, unlike Germany or Denmark. Decades of revolutionary solidarity are the foundation of the two countries' relationship. Cuba didn't hesitate when President Traoré stood strong after the attempt failed. Bruno Rodriguez, the foreign minister, came to Ouagadougou to speak with Traoré in person. It was not a handshake of symbolic meaning. it was a statement of confidence. Their conversation centered on Cuba's achievements in 2024 and future problems, Rodriguez subsequently wrote on social media. However, there was more going on behind the official words. Mutual respect between two countries that have always stood together without the consent of the West. Cuba's foreign minister said, a high level of commitment to the homeland was expressed, in a statement that went much beyond protocol. He referenced history during his conversation with President Traoré, rather than only discussing current events. He recalled the fabled relationship between Fidel and Raúl Castro, the Cuban revolutionaries, and Thomas Sankara. It served as a reminder that this alliance was not brand new. It was the passing of a torch. He honored a common revolutionary heritage that continues to inspire modern diplomacy by meeting with solidarity activists and the Cuba-Burkina Faso fraternity organizations at the Sankara Memorial. He reiterated Cuba's commitment to enhancing relations in a meeting with his counterpart from Burkina Faso, Jean-Marie Traoré, particularly since 2025 would mark 50 years of continuous diplomatic relations between the two countries. However, this is about action as much as symbolic. A significant agreement that signaled a new phase of collaboration was reached a few months before to the visit. Cuban Ambassador Nadisca Navarro visited Ouagadougou on September 4, 2024, hosted by Stella Adine Kabor, Burkina Faso's ministerial envoy for regional cooperation. They talked about extending their cooperation into new Burkina Faso territories. Along with a representative from the Luxembourg Agency for Development Works, the ambassador arrived not just as a diplomat, but also as a collaborator, initiating a tripartite project. Cuba has made it plain that it wants to work with Burkina Faso, and not merely provide political support. Cuba and Burkina Faso are demonstrating that certain alliances are made to last in a world where many countries wait to see which way the wind blows. The ambassador added that all parties concerned would choose and identify these areas, but she will make sure Burkina Faso gives priority to them. According to her, we may work on initiatives in a tripartite fashion, with Luxembourg handling the financial resources and Cuba contributing the expertise. The Burkina Faso official responded by praising the positive ties between Burkina Faso and Cuba, as well as the impending investments from Luxembourg and Cuba. She added that in order to find initiatives that will benefit the Burkina Faso people, Cuba must collaborate with the country's various ministries. Although this was the first agreement inked between Burkina Faso and Cuba, the two countries have been friends for a long time. Actually, for more than 40 years, Burkina Faso and Cuba have enjoyed excellent diplomatic ties. Both nations benefit from this partnership, which dates back to 1975. It is understandable why the two nations commemorated the 48th anniversary of the start of their bilateral ties last year. Burkina Faso has supported Cuba's request at the UN to break the economic, trade, and financial blockade imposed by the United States on the island nation for more than 60 years, and Cuba has helped train doctors in Burkina Faso in recent years. Despite their stark differences on the map, Cuba and Burkina Faso are united in their unrelenting fight against Western dominance. Cuba, like Burkina Faso, has resisted colonial pressure and maintained its position. However, Cuba's struggle has been more arduous and prolonged. The island nation has faced one of the most severe economic sanctions regimes in contemporary history for more than 60 years, imposed by the United States alone, rather than by the rest of the world. This blockade, which began on February 3, 1962, has stifled Cuba's economy, increased living expenses, caused widespread shortages, and cost the country more than $144 billion in losses. Industry, trade, healthcare, and education were all destroyed. Furthermore, Washington has not changed its stance in spite of 31 UN resolutions demanding the lifting of the sanctions. However, it goes farther. In addition to tightening the blockade, the US has imposed further penalties and designated Cuba a state supporter of terrorism, without providing any supporting documentation. These actions had nothing to do with facts or fairness. They have to do with power. The kind of authority that is unaffected by international censure and functions outside the law. In actuality, nations like the US take action because they can, not because they have to. The global uproar is meaningless when justice is served by force. And Cuba, Burkina Faso, and other countries have learned this lesson directly. Sovereignty is not conferred in a world where empires write the laws. It is fully paid for, protected, and taken. According to the United States, human rights abuses, communism, and regional instability are the reasons behind its sanctions against Cuba. Let's be honest though, this has to do with punishment. Cuba made a decision decades ago. With the Soviet Union, it stood. The United States has never forgiven it for it. Democracy has nothing to do with the blockage. It has to do with dominance. It is intended to send a message to any little country that has the audacity to challenge the international system. Burkina Faso and Cuba, meanwhile, have declined to bow. There is more than simply common suffering between these two countries. It's a widely held belief in sovereignty, self-determination, and the unalienable right to freedom. And Cuba has repeatedly demonstrated this allegiance, especially in Africa. Cuba, unlike the West, supported African liberation forces throughout the Cold War by providing not just soldiers, but also physicians, educators, and engineers. Therefore, Cuba's current investment in Burkina Faso is not a change of direction. It's carrying on a tradition. The only thing that has changed is the tools. Today, biotechnology replaces the weaponry of the past. Today, there are scientists and doctors where there used to be troops. Cuba provides something more profound. Whereas Western countries frequently limit alliances to influence and profit margins. Struggle is the foundation of solidarity. Burkina Faso benefits from Cuba's expertise despite its own economic constraints. Its cutting-edge renewable energy innovations, biotech breakthroughs, and well-known healthcare system. It's a different kind of aid, one that aims to uplift rather than trap. By doing this, Cuba is assisting Burkina Faso in creating the kind of future that Western nations have never really provided. One that is characterized by dignity rather than dependency. Cuba is now more than just an ally, in fact. It is now used as an example, an inspiration, a real-life example of how a country can withstand, endure, and even prosper without the help and influence of the West. Its expanding collaboration with Burkina Faso is evidence that collaboration need not be constrained. This is not your average exploitation-based transactional agreement. It's reciprocal. It is a calculated move. It is revolutionary. By making investments in Burkina Faso, Cuba expands its diplomatic reach throughout Africa, especially with countries that have a history of opposing Western domination and fighting against colonialism. Additionally, this is a matter of economic survival for a nation that has been harmed by decades of sanctions. Cuba is doing more than just helping others by working together in fields like biotech, healthcare, and renewable energy. In order to grow outside of US-dominated structures, it is diversifying its own economy. However, the answer to the question of whether Cuba's involvement in Burkina Faso is unexpected is straightforward. Absolutely not. The connection between these two countries is strong and was forged by Thomas Sankara, a man who helped to establish modern-day Burkina Faso. Sankara was not only a fan of Fidel Castro and Che Guevara when he came to power. He imitated them. He saw a model for revolutionary government in Cuba. Motivated by Castro's grassroots approach to revolutionary vigilance, he formed committees to defend the revolution. Sankara saw Cuba as a brother in arms in the struggle for justice, dignity, and sovereignty around the world, not as a far-off ally. And that legacy endures today as President Traoré follows a similar course. In action, not in speeches. Not surprisingly, he was dubbed the African Che Guevara. Thomas Sankara, like Fidel Castro and Che Guevara, was a revolutionary who was despised by the Western powers, feared by the establishment, and adored by the general populace. He was more than just a charmer. He refused to back down. After a heated argument, French President François Mitterrand once called him a tough guy. That would be an understatement, though. Sankara posed a threat due to his beliefs rather than his use of violence. Risky concepts. Notions that Africa was self-sufficient, that Paris, Washington, or any other Western city would no longer be able to dictate to Burkina Faso. He publicly stated that his nation would select its own allies, including alleged Western adversaries like as China, the Soviet Union, North Korea, and Cuba. There is more to President Ibrahim Traoré's increasing backing from countries like Denmark and Cuba. Rarely have we been able to observe this in African history. That world respect may be earned by African leaders. That the world, not just their people, can be moved by their love. However, that respect is never freely offered. You have to earn it. Through service rather than subjection. By standing up for the people, not by pleading for help. Men who traded their country's destiny for briefcases of Western cash and promises of political power have dominated the African continent for far too long. What about the West? They have figured out the pattern. Put pressure on it. Provide incentives. Observe the leaders bending. However, Traoré deviated from the norm. Even Western countries have had to change their tone due to his strength, clarity, and refusal to compromise. It is understandable why he and the AES leadership have been characterized as intelligent by US military officials. Since they are aware that they are not interacting with puppets, they are up against powerful men. The lesson is this, and it must reverberate across all of the continent's capitals. No plea is made for sovereignty. It is asserted. Traoré led his people without seeking permission. They became loyal to him. And he acquired the authority that no outside influence could ever give him because of that loyalty. What do you think? Make sure to like the video and subscribe for more content like this.